The case of Jenn Carson, the girl who escaped her father's death cult. In the world of true crime, some stories feel too horrifying to be real. Stories that go beyond the realm of normal human behavior. Stories that expose the darkest depths of the human mind. This is one of those stories. A tale of a little girl who grew up in the shadow of unimaginable horror, trapped in the grasp of her father's sinister beliefs. But instead of becoming another casualty of his madness, she broke free. And not only did she escape, but she dedicated her life to making sure his victims were never forgotten. Jenn Carson was only a child when she realized her father was not like other fathers. In the late 1970s, her father, James Carson, and his second wife, Susan, fell into a spiral of radicalism, violence, and paranoia. They abandoned their former lives, convinced they were on a divine mission to cleanse the world of so-called witches. It was a delusion that would soon lead to a string of brutal murders, all committed in the name of their twisted ideology. From the outside, James Carson once seemed like an ordinary man. He was intelligent, well-educated, and had once lived a relatively conventional life. But something changed. As he and Susan became more immersed in their extremist beliefs, they began to see enemies everywhere. They believed they were soldiers of God, chosen to rid the world of those they saw as evil. In reality, they were nothing more than serial killers, preying on those who had the misfortune of crossing their path. Jenn, just a young girl at the time, was caught in the middle of this terrifying world. She lived under the control of two people who had completely detached from reality, people who believed that murder was not only justified but necessary. She saw things no child should ever see, lived in fear of what might happen next, and knew, even at her young age, that something was very, very wrong. Her father and stepmother were unpredictable and dangerous, constantly moving from place to place, evading authorities while carrying out their so-called mission. They targeted individuals they believed to be witches or threats to their ideology. Their victims included acquaintances, co-workers, and even strangers. Each murder was brutal, carried out with no remorse, justified only by the delusions they had convinced themselves were real. Jenn's world was one of instability and fear. She grew up in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing when the next act of violence would come. But even as a child, she had an instinct, a deep inner knowledge that what her father was doing was wrong. She may not have fully understood the scope of his crimes at the time, but she knew enough to be afraid. She knew enough to want to escape. And eventually she did. Authorities finally caught up with James and Susan Carson in 1983. By then, they had left behind a trail of victims, a history of unspeakable brutality. They had been on the run, their faces plastered across newspapers as the public began to understand the true horror of their crimes. But despite their efforts to evade capture, their violent spree came to an end. They were arrested and convicted, sentenced to life in prison for multiple murders. For the first time in her life, Jenn was free from their grasp. But freedom did not come easily. Even with her father behind bars, his influence still loomed over her. She had spent years living in fear, surrounded by violence, and the trauma of that experience did not simply disappear overnight. She was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered childhood, to navigate a world where her name would always be tied to her father's crimes. The weight of being the daughter of a serial killer is a burden few can understand. Society often wonders about the children of such people. Are they destined to follow in their parents' footsteps? Can evil be inherited? These were the questions that haunted Jenn as she grew older. She worried about what her father's blood might mean for her future. Was she doomed to be like him? Was there a darkness inside her that she could never escape? But as she grew, she found her answer. She was not like her father. She was not like Susan. She was not destined to carry on their legacy of violence. Instead, she chose a different path. A path of justice, a path of healing. Jenn dedicated her life to fighting for the victims of violent crime. She became an advocate for children of incarcerated parents, those who, like her, were left to deal with the consequences of their parents' actions. She spoke out about her experiences, sharing her story in the hopes that it would help others. She refused to let her father's crimes define her, and she refused to let his victims be forgotten. Her work has helped bring attention to the struggles of those left behind in the wake of violent crime. While society often focuses on the perpetrators, their children are often ignored, left to carry the shame, the trauma, and the fear that comes with their parents' actions. Jenn has worked to change that, to give a voice to those who have been silenced, to help those who have been forced to live in the shadow of their parents' crimes. Her story is one of survival, but it is also one of resilience. Despite the horrors she endured, she refused to let them consume her. She refused to let her father's evil dictate her future. James and Susan Carson, later known as the San Francisco Witch Killers, showed no remorse for their crimes. Even after their convictions, they continued to insist that they had been acting on divine orders. Their delusions remained intact, their sense of justice twisted beyond comprehension. They saw themselves as warriors of righteousness, not the cold-blooded murderers they truly were. Their case remains one of the most bizarre in criminal history, a mixture of religious fanaticism, violent paranoia, and a complete detachment from reality. The depth of their delusions is what makes this story so disturbing. They did not kill for money, for power, or for revenge. They killed because they believed it was their mission. And in doing so, they left behind a wake of pain and suffering that extended far beyond their direct victims. But while James and Susan's story is one of destruction, Jenn's is one of hope. She proves that a person's origins do not have to define their destiny, that even those born into darkness can choose to create their own light. Her journey has been fraught with challenges, battling the echoes of her past, confronting fears, and redefining who she was beyond her father's crimes. But rather than allowing trauma to silence her, she became an advocate, determined to give a voice to those left in its wake. She worked to turn pain into purpose, making sure that no other child in her position felt alone. Jenn Carson had every reason to disappear into the shadows of her past, but she refused. Instead of being bound by tragedy, she reshaped it into a force for change. She spoke out, not just for herself, but for those who suffered in silence, those struggling to separate themselves from the sins of their parents. She did not let her father's crimes become the chains that held her back. Instead, she used her experience as a catalyst for justice, fighting for victims, amplifying their stories, and proving that even in the face of cruelty, compassion can thrive. Her story is not just about survival. It's about transformation, a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the power of reclaiming one's own narrative. She is living proof that resilience can break even the deepest cycles of violence, and that a person's future is not determined by their past. Her father's crimes will forever be a part of history, a chilling reminder of the dangers of fanaticism and unchecked illusion. But Jenn Carson's story is a different kind of legacy, one of courage, purpose, and hope. Because in the end, the true impact of a story is not in its horror, but in the strength of those who rise above it. And Jenn Carson has risen. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that deserve to be told. Your support helps bring these stories to light, ensuring that the past is remembered and that justice in all its forms continues to be pursued.